I speak to you now not as a mere chronicler of dates and events, but as an unseen witness to every breath, every flicker of candlelight, and every shadow that moved across the cold stone walls of the royal palace. What I am about to recount is not the tale of a righteous monarch, nor of a simple court intrigue. It is the beginning of a chain of events so strange and merciless that its echoes would linger for generations. This is the story of King Aydan, and the order that would change the fate of his queen forever. In a distant land, hidden between jagged mountains crowned with snow, there lay the Kingdom of Caerth. It was a realm of iron and frost, where the wind could strip the breath from a man's chest, and the people's hearts were hardened by centuries of war. At the heart of this realm stood the palace, a fortress of black stone that had endured 100 sieges and never once fallen. Upon the throne sat King Aydan, a man carved by the cruelty of his youth. His eyes were like shards of obsidian, cold and unblinking. He was feared not only for his skill in battle but for his unyielding laws. To speak a lie in his court was to forfeit one's tongue. To betray him was to vanish into the dungeons beneath the fortress, from which no soul had ever returned. The people called him the Iron King. Yet there was something they did not know, something even his most loyal advisors could only sense but never name. Aydan carried within him a shadow, a deep, unspoken fear of being seen as weak. It was this fear that planted the seed of his most infamous command. His queen, Olivia, was unlike him in every way. She was born of the southern coast, where the sun touched the skin with gold, and the air carried the scent of salt and citrus. Her beauty was not of the fragile kind that wilts under scrutiny, but of the enduring kind that grows stronger under hardship. In the early years of their union, she had been his solace, the one voice in the court that could speak to him without trembling. Yet as the seasons passed, the warmth between them cooled, replaced by something distant, watchful, and unspoken. When the queen's pregnancy was announced, the court erupted in celebration. After years without an heir, the continuation of the royal bloodline seemed assured. Feasts were held, banners were raised, and emissaries from distant lands brought gifts of gold and rare silk. Yet the king's reaction was curiously restrained. He offered no public smile, no display of joy. Instead, he summoned his council behind closed doors. What transpired in that chamber would soon become the most whispered tale in Caerth. Aydan, his voice low and deliberate, declared that the birth of his child would take place not in the secrecy of the queen's chambers, but before the eyes of the entire royal court. Every lord, every lady, every foreign envoy, and every ranking knight would stand witness as the queen brought forth the heir. His reasoning, as he explained, was simple and yet chilling. No one will question the blood of my heir. No one will dare whisper that this child is not of my seed. The council sat in stunned silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, others glanced at one another, but none dared to challenge him. The king's command was absolute. By the end of that same day, messengers were already dispatched to summon the nobility for the day of the birth. When Queen Olivia learned of this decree, the color drained from her face. To give birth was an ordeal of pain and vulnerability. To do so under the gaze of dozens, perhaps hundreds, was unthinkable. Yet she knew the danger of refusal. In Caerth, to defy the king was to invite ruin, and not just upon oneself, but upon one's entire family. Still, I saw in her eyes the flicker of something else, a spark that did not die even as her fear grew. Whether it was defiance or a secret knowledge, I could not yet tell. In the weeks that followed, preparations for the public birth became a grim spectacle in itself. The great hall, where feasts and celebrations were usually held, was transformed into a strange, ceremonial chamber. Rich carpets were laid over the cold stone floor, tapestries depicting the royal lineage were hung from the walls, and a raised platform was constructed at the center. A platform upon which the queen would be seated when the time came. It was as though the king intended the birth to be not merely witnessed, but staged. Behind the scenes, whispers began to curl through the corridors like smoke. Some claimed that the king's true motive was not fear of doubt, but suspicion that his queen's loyalty had been divided. Others hinted that a prophecy had been spoken in secret, one that foretold the birth of a child who would either unite the kingdom or bring about its fall. I too began to wonder if this was merely about proof of blood, or if there were darker currents moving beneath the surface. The queen, though outwardly composed, began to move differently through the palace. She spoke less, listened more, and avoided the eyes of certain courtiers. One evening, I followed her unseen, as she slipped through a side passage into the old chapel, a place unused for years. There, by the light of a single candle, she met with a hooded figure whose face I could not see. They spoke in hushed tones, and though I could not hear their words, I saw her grasp the figure's hand tightly before departing. That night, she returned to her chambers with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. The days crept forward, each one thick with tension. Every noble in the land had received the king's summons, and the palace began to swell with guests. Some eager, some uneasy, and some with eyes that measured the halls as if seeking hidden doors. The smell of perfumed oils and polished wood filled the air, but beneath it lingered the scent of something else. Expectation sharpened to a knife's edge. I knew, as all who walked those corridors knew, that the day of the birth would not be the end of this story. It would be the beginning. Something was coming, something that would shatter the fragile balance of power in Caerth. And though the king believed himself in control, I could feel it already slipping from his grasp. The moment the first cry of the child echoed through the great hall, the truth, whatever it might be, would be set loose, and nothing, not even the Iron King himself, would be able to stop it. The day of the birth arrived beneath a sky the color of lead. The sun did not so much rise as struggle through a veil of heavy clouds, casting the land in a dull silver gloom. The palace was restless before dawn. Servants hurried along the corridors with urgent steps, carrying linens, basins of steaming water, and bundles of herbs. The great hall, transformed over the past weeks into a stage for the most intimate of acts, now glowed with the light of hundreds of candles. The air was thick with incense, meant to mask the smell of pain and blood. The nobility gathered early. Cloaks were shaken free of snow at the doors, jeweled hands brushed imaginary dust from silk sleeves, and eyes, so many eyes, darted toward the raised platform at the center. There sat the queen's chair, carved from dark oak and cushioned in crimson velvet, as though this were some royal ceremony rather than the raw threshold between life and death. Behind it, the king's throne stood like a shadow, looming over the space where his wife would soon labor. I moved among them unnoticed, listening to the low murmurs that swirled like an undercurrent beneath the polite greetings. Lords from the northern marches whispered of border unrest, ladies from the southern coast speculated about the child's features, and foreign envoys from distant kingdoms exchanged glances that spoke of private calculations. Some faces carried thin smiles, others masks of solemnity, but all were drawn by the same morbid curiosity, to see not just the birth, but the truth it might reveal. The queen arrived under heavy guard, though it was said to be for ceremony rather than safety. She was pale, her hands folded over her swollen belly, yet her gaze was steady, fixed ahead as she crossed the hall. Whispers rose and fell like the rustle of leaves. When she mounted the platform and lowered herself into the chair, I noticed her glance briefly toward the upper gallery. A glance so fleeting most would have missed it. But I followed it, and saw a figure there, cloaked in shadow, watching with an intensity that set my blood on edge. The king entered last. His armor gleamed, though there was no need for armor here. His presence alone silenced the murmurs. He took his place upon the throne, his hands resting heavily on the armrests, and for a long moment he simply looked at his wife. It was not the look of a man awaiting a child, but the stare of a judge awaiting a verdict. The midwives, chosen personally by the king, began their work. Yet even as they moved with professional precision, I saw the queen's eyes shift toward one among them, a woman older than the rest, with streaks of silver in her hair. There was a silent exchange there, one that spoke of trust. The older woman's hand brushed the queen's arm as though passing something, but the motion was masked by the arrangement of cloth. The labor began in earnest. The queen's breath grew ragged, her knuckles white against the arms of the chair. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, and used to seeing such raw human struggle without the veil of privacy. The king, however, did not flinch. He sat as if carved from stone, his gaze never leaving her. And then a whisper reached me. Not from the crowd, but from the shadowed figure in the upper gallery. A voice so low it was almost a thought, yet I knew the queen heard it too. Her head tilted ever so slightly, as though listening. Whatever was spoken seemed to steady her, for her breathing slowed, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. This was no ordinary act of endurance. This was control. The first wail of the newborn cut through the hall like a blade through silence. The midwives moved swiftly, wrapping the child in fine linen before turning toward the king. But before they could take a single step, the queen's voice rang out, hoarse from labor yet commanding. "Place my child in my arms first." It was a breach of protocol. The king's brows drew together, but he did not speak. The child was placed against her chest, and she looked down at it with a gaze so fierce it was almost defiant. Then she raised her head and said words that froze the hall. "This is the true heir of Caerth, and I alone know why." The silence that followed was not mere surprise. It was the sharp intake of 100 minds suddenly turning. The king's eyes narrowed, but before he could rise, the queen spoke again, her voice steady despite the strain. "There are those among you who believe this child was not conceived in loyalty to the throne. You are wrong. But there is another truth, one far more dangerous." I could feel the tension coil like a serpent ready to strike. The king's hand twitched toward the hilt of the ceremonial sword at his side. The queen saw it and smiled, not with warmth, but with the calm of someone who had already stepped beyond fear. "I will speak that truth," she said. "But not today, not here. For if I were to reveal it now, some of you would not live to leave this hall." Her words spread through the assembly like fire through dry grass. Faces shifted from curiosity to alarm, from amusement to dread. The king's command had been meant to end all whispers. Instead, it had birthed new ones, louder and more dangerous than before. The child was finally taken from her to be presented formally to the king. He looked down at the small bundle, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his gaze to the crowd, his voice carrying across the hall. "The heir of Caerth is born. Remember this day." It was not a blessing. It was a warning. As the guests filed out, I remained in the shadows, watching. The queen was carried back to her chambers, the older midwife at her side. The king lingered, speaking in low tones to a man I recognized as Lord Theron, a man whose loyalty was often whispered to be for sale. Their words were too quiet to catch, but I saw the king's hand close around Theron's shoulder with the grip of a master setting a task. I knew then that the game had begun. Whatever truth the queen held was a weapon, and the king would stop at nothing to seize it before it could be spoken aloud. But I also knew this: she had allies, and not all of them wore the colors of Caerth. The storm had broken. Now the flood would follow. The days following the birth unfolded like the tightening of a noose. The king's public decree had ended with ceremony, but the true consequences began in the quiet hours, behind locked doors, in unlit corridors, in chambers where the fire burned low and voices were reduced to whispers. The queen remained in her private apartments under the guise of recovery, but I could see it for what it was, a kind of confinement. Guards stood outside her doors day and night, chosen not from the palace watch but from the king's personal retinue. They were not there to protect her. They were there to ensure she could not leave, and perhaps more importantly, that no one could enter without the king's approval. And yet, she was not as cut off as the king believed. Servants moved through the palace with the invisibility of those too low to be noticed, carrying trays of food, jugs of water, and fresh linens. A word here, a slip of parchment there, this was how messages moved. I saw it more than once. A servant pausing just long enough at the queen's door for a folded scrap to disappear between the folds of her gown before she entered. It was through such channels that the queen remained in contact with those beyond the palace walls. And one night I followed one of these messengers. The servant, a boy of no more than 15, moved with practiced speed through the narrow servant passages, descending into the lower levels of the palace where the air smelled of stone and damp earth. He emerged into the stables, where a cloaked rider awaited. There was no exchange of coin, no words spoken, only a quick passing of the folded message before the rider urged his horse into the darkness. The hoofbeats faded toward the southern road, the road to the coast, where the queen's family still held power. But not all movements belonged to her. The king had begun to summon certain lords and knights in the dead of night, calling them into his private war room. I slipped close enough to see the faces. Lord Theron, the same man I had seen in the great hall after the birth. Sir Malric, commander of the palace guard. Lady Serine, whose lands bordered the kingdom's richest silver mines. They did not meet in council as equals, but as soldiers before their general. On the third night of such meetings, I caught fragments of the king's voice through the heavy wooden door. She will not speak in public, not unless she believes herself beyond my reach. A pause. The scrape of boots on stone. Find what she guards. Find who carries it. And if it cannot be taken, silence it. The command was not shouted, but its weight was iron. It became clear to me that the queen's words in the great hall had struck deeper than the king expected. She had not only challenged the doubts about the child. She had implied the existence of a secret so dangerous it could shake the throne. The king's fear of being seen as weak had transformed into something sharper. The fear that power might already be slipping from his grasp. But the queen was not idle. From my vantage in the shadows of her chamber, I saw her call for the older midwife, the one who had been at her side during the birth. The woman brought with her a small chest of polished wood. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen, was something I could not immediately see. The queen unwrapped it slowly, revealing a pendant, a circular medallion of gold etched with a sigil I did not recognize. It was no mere ornament. The way she held it, the reverence in her touch, told me it was both a key and a weapon. This, she said softly to the midwife, must reach the one in the gallery. The words struck me like a blow. She had seen the shadowed figure on the day of the birth. She had known who it was. And now she intended to give them this object, this thing she clearly believed could alter the balance of power. 2 nights later, the palace changed. It began with the arrival of a foreign delegation from the east, envoys from the Kingdom of Caerth, their cloaks lined with the pale fur of northern beasts, their swords curved and polished to a mirror's edge. Officially, they came to offer gifts for the newborn heir. Unofficially, they brought with them eyes that missed nothing and tongues that spoke in riddles. The king greeted them with formal courtesy, yet I saw the tension in his jaw. Caerth had long been both ally and rival, its loyalty shifting like the tide. Their sudden interest in Caerth's succession was no accident. That evening, during the feast in their honor, the queen appeared for the first time since the birth. She moved with deliberate grace, wearing a gown the color of midnight, her hair crowned not with jewels but with a simple silver circlet. Her gaze swept the hall, pausing, only for a moment, on one of the Dravanian envoys. He inclined his head slightly, and something unspoken passed between them. The king noticed. When the feast ended, I followed as he left the hall and strode toward the queen's chambers. His steps were fast, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword. I could not follow inside, but I heard the voices, his sharp and furious, hers calm and unyielding. "You will not play this game with me," he said. "You began the game," she replied. "I am only choosing my move." There was the sound of something striking wood, a fist, perhaps, against the table. Then silence. When the king emerged, his expression was one of cold decision. I knew then that whatever patience he had possessed was gone. By the next morning, the guards outside the queen's chambers had doubled. The older midwife had vanished from the palace entirely. Some said she had been sent away with reward and honor. Others that she had been taken to the dungeons beneath the fortress. I did not know which to believe. And yet, I saw the queen that afternoon, standing at her window, the newborn in her arms. Her face was serene, but her eyes told a different story. She had lost a piece on the board, but she had not lost the game. I knew, and the king must have known, that whatever truth she carried had not been silenced. It was still out there, moving beyond the palace walls, toward hands that might one day place it in the light. The air in Caerth had changed. We were no longer waiting for a secret to be revealed. We were waiting for the first open strike. It happened on the 22nd day after the birth. The palace awoke to the clang of bells, not the clear peal of celebration, but the deep, uneven toll reserved for alarm. Servants froze in their steps, guards abandoned their posts to rush toward the western gates, and the air filled with the sound of boots on stone. From the high gallery, I could see a cloud of riders approaching through the swirling snow. Their banners bore no sigil of Caerth. The king was already in the courtyard when they arrived. At their head rode a figure I recognized, the Dravanian envoy from the feast, the one who had exchanged that fleeting glance with the queen. He dismounted with practiced elegance and bowed, but it was not the bow of a subject. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice meant to carry, "I come bearing the word of my sovereign, and a gift from your queen." At those words, a murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. The king's eyes hardened. "My queen sends no gifts without my knowledge." The envoy smiled slightly, as though expecting the challenge. From within his cloak, he drew a small bundle wrapped in deep blue silk. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unfolded it to reveal the golden medallion, the same one I had seen in the queen's possession. "This," the envoy declared, "is the seal of Varen, lost to the world for nearly a century. It carries not only the right to rule Caerth, but proof of the one who is its rightful heir." The words struck like a thrown spear. The crowd shifted, a few voices rising in confused whispers. The king's voice cut through them like a blade. "And who, exactly, does this relic name?" The envoy's smile vanished. "Your son, and the bloodline of the queen's house." It was a masterstroke, not an accusation of illegitimacy, but a claim that the child's right to the throne flowed as much from the queen's lineage as from the king's. That the throne could, in theory, pass into the hands of her southern kin should the king fall. For the first time since I had known him, the king's composure faltered. It was only for a breath, but I saw it, the tightening of his mouth, the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He turned sharply and ordered the envoy to be taken to the great hall for a private audience. Yet the moment the king vanished through the doors, the crowd began to speak in low, urgent tones. The rumor had already taken root, and once planted, such seeds were nearly impossible to kill. That night, the palace became a place of two worlds. The brightly lit corridors where guards patrolled in visible strength, and the shadowed passages where whispers carried news faster than any royal messenger. The queen's chambers remained under heavy guard, but now those guards were as much to keep her in as to keep others out. Still, she found her way. I was there when she emerged into the chapel under cover of darkness, the newborn in her arms. Waiting for her was the same cloaked figure from the day of the birth, now unhooded, revealing a man with the hard, weathered face of a soldier and the eyes of someone who had seen more than one war. He knelt before her, not as a subject, but as one swearing a private oath. "The medallion has reached Dravan. The claim is made. The king will move against you before the moon turns." "I know," she replied softly, "but he will not move fast enough." Her words were not boast, but calculation. She turned her gaze toward the altar, where a map of Caerth lay unrolled, marked in fresh ink. The southern coast, the queen's homeland, was already shaded in the color of her house. Two other regions bore fresh sigils, lords who had pledged themselves quietly to her cause. The child in her arms stirred, and she bent her head to whisper, though I could still hear her words. "You will inherit a throne unbroken by his tyranny, and if the cost is war, so be it." The decision had been made. The first strike came 3 nights later. Lord Theron, the king's informant, was found dead in the stables, a single knife buried to the hilt in his chest. No guards had seen the killer. By morning, 2 more of the king's most loyal captains had vanished, their chambers stripped bare. The palace was no longer simply the king's fortress. It had become a battlefield of shadows. The king moved quickly. At dawn, he stormed the queen's chambers, demanding the name of every man and woman who had aided her. She met his fury with silence, holding the child close. I saw in his face then not just rage, but something colder, fear. That same day, the Dravanian envoy was expelled from Caerth under threat of death. But it was too late. The message had already spread beyond the palace walls, carried by merchants, soldiers, and priests. In the taverns of the city, men were already placing wagers on which banner would fly above the palace by winter's end. The final act came swiftly. On the night of the winter solstice, when the longest shadow cloaked the land, the queen's allies struck from within. Half the palace guard turned their swords against their fellows, opening the gates to riders from the south. The king, caught between battle in the courtyard and betrayal in his halls, fought like a man who knew the end had come. I watched from the gallery as he and the queen faced one another in the great hall for the last time. The child was not with her, already spirited away to safety. "You have destroyed your own kingdom," he said, his voice hoarse with fury. "No," she replied, her voice calm as ice. "I have freed it from yours." There was no hesitation in her hand as she drew the dagger from her sleeve. It was not she who struck the final blow. That was done by the soldier from the chapel, stepping from the shadows to drive his blade into the king's heart. But it was her eyes the king saw as he fell, and her name that was whispered in his final breath. By dawn, the banners of Caerth bore a new sigil, the joined emblems of the king's and queen's houses, the medallion of Varen displayed at their center. The war would come, yes, but it would be fought under her rule, not his. And I, who had watched from the first whisper to the final cry, knew this truth. The birth in the great hall had not been the king's triumph, but the queen's first move. It was never about proving the child's blood. It was about showing the court and the world that she could command their gaze, their whispers, and, in time, their swords. The king had ordered her to give birth before all. She had obeyed, and in doing so she had taken his throne.